All right, a lot to get through tonight. Joining me now to do all of that, the host of Weekends on 2GB, Michael Mclaren. Michael, thank you for being with us again on Thursday. I love it because you've got the radio sense, you've got your talkback caller sense when you bring all of these issues to the fore. Unemployment, we saw those figures out today, 3.7%. They were predicting something like 3.75. This is the Reserve Bank in their latest statement on monetary policy by the end of the year. Now, these are January's figures. We're already almost at their prediction early on, meaning I think there's going to be more jobs go this year. It's the second consecutive month the economy has lost jobs. Add in this issue with inflation, we still can't get it under control. We saw the governor yesterday talk about more interest rates. I can't say how high they're going to go. And I made the point then, we've got 200,000 people, which is much higher than we ever saw under the Howard era, about to arrive in Australia. That's what the government wants. That's what they put in the October budget. All of that pressure on jobs, it doesn't bode well, does it?
No, it doesn't. I think basically what you're saying with all those statistics, and they're all right, Peter, is it's going to get worse. And it's getting worse earlier than the official statistics suggested it might, or the predictions. I mean, you've been in Canberra a long time. You know the predictions are genuinely wrong. So you take them with a pinch of salt or a grain of salt or whatever measurement you want to use. But for the everyday person listening to us now, it could well be a case of watch this space. In fact, I think it will be a case of watch this space. And you mentioned Philip Lowe just a second ago. He's been clobbered the last few weeks, and some of the belting, I think, is fair enough because he did something very silly months and months ago, almost encouraging people to continue to borrow to buy overpriced houses because he basically said it won't be until next year, 2024, that rates will go up. And people took him at his word. After all, he's sort of the guru of the finance world in this country, and he was wrong. But what Philip Lowe and the Reserve are trying to do with interest rates is, I think, largely mop up the inflationary pressures which have been coming through via the political class. I mean, it's not the Reserve Bank, as you highlight, which is in control of immigration and that drives property prices and all. It's the federal government. It's not the Reserve Bank that really controls anything to do with industrial relations policy or energy policy or anything. That's the federal and state governments. And the list goes on and on and on. Now, they're going to try to belt Philip Lowe up here, subtly. They're at arm's length, of course. But I think people should just be aware to the tactics which are going to be at play. For too long we've had inflationary pressures being driven by coalition and now Labor governments, and the Reserve for so many months are now trying to rein it in. 9 hikes in a row. They still haven't done it. They've both got to get on the same page here. They should have done it ages ago. Now, quickly, with all of that said, the Reserve do deserve criticism, and I think the main criticism is they went too low at 0.1%. I don't think there was ever a need for Australia to go that low. And now we're raising that curve, but so are a lot of other countries around the world.
There wasn't a need for us to spend billions and billions of dollars as we did. There wasn't a need for us to lock up. I think that right across the board there was a fair amount of early pandemic panic. But we didn't rein it in 2021 when we should have. We were slow to get out of it in 2022. I make a point, I want to go to something else, but I make a point too. The Australian Financial Review today says a combination of these rate rises and house values dropping. We've got about 120,000 of us around the country owning homes that are in negative equity. Now, you go back to the GFC and the subprime crisis, a little bit different than what we're going through now, but that was a real issue when people then went to sell a home because they'd lost their job and found that they were never going to get back what they owed the bank. Let's go to the issue of treaty because it's become interlinked ever since Lydia Thorpe walked away last week with the voice at a national level. Well, we know now too, we've got a treaty process in Victoria, we've got one in South Australia. Legislation is about to hit the Parliament in Queensland, introduced next week. There'll be treaty legislation, a 5-member truth-telling and healing inquiry. We don't know what that really means, but that's certainly there with the Minister, the Premier there, Anastasia Palaszczuk. We're going to have treaties right around the country. It's not Victoria with all Victorian Aboriginal people. It will be with the multitude of clan groups in Victoria, the multitude in Queensland, and we'll have them in South Australia. And we'll have all these national treaties. I mean, honestly, really and truly, this is the death knell for the voice if people understand this is what they're getting, Michael.
Well, you suspect so. I mean, they're going hand in glove, aren't they? And I know federally they're saying, oh, no, nothing to see here. It's completely separate. But I don't think people are going to be able to separate the two. And I don't think a lot of the advocates of one or the other are able to separate the two. In fact, I think you've got quotes on file there where people are equating the two or saying one needs to be harmonious with the other, so the voice with treaties. But you know, the average person watching now, Peter, will be saying, you know, I thought the reconciliation process in this nation had pretty much got to the point, a very mature point, where no longer did we see people necessarily through a prism of colour or their background or whatever. We saw everyone as Australians, and we hire as Australians. The laws, as far as I'm aware, you know better than me, but they're non-discriminatory in that relevant sense. So we've sort of, I would have thought, got toward the end of that journey. I suspect, though, what we're seeing here is the truth that the reconciliation project will never come to its final destination. It's going to be an ongoing project, and I think for a lot of people, it's a rather lucrative project, isn't it?
Michael's point there about will Australians see this state-based treaty movement as applicable to the Commonwealth and the voice? Well, here you go. Here's the Greens' new Indigenous spokeswoman, Dorinda Cox. This is the federal Greens spokeswoman. Here she is with Laura Jays this morning. Have a listen.
It's important to have a voice, and the establishment of the voice will be complementary to treaty making. We need to ensure that sovereign to sovereign nations are able to sit down and negotiate with each other, but also with, as I said, all levels of government.
And we know the Greens are supporting the voice, which is why Thorpe has walked, because in Adam Bandt's own words, he said this last week, he has had private assurances from the Prime Minister on issues like treaty and truth-telling.
Yeah, look, when people in halls of power start talking about sovereign nations, plural, I think a lot of people, are right to question really, Peter, what that means. Beyond that, if we're to have a treaty, but multiple treaties in multiple states, what is it actually about? You know, we're hearing in Queensland this is going to be about truth-telling and healing, and as I said, for most people, I think a lot of Indigenous Australians, the reconciliation process has brought about over the years, surely, a lot of healing and a hell of a lot of truth-telling, and important all of that was. But what truth and what healing now? I mean, what is it exactly that is being proposed or might well happen here? I think people deserve to know those details. I'm not sure they do. To be honest, I'm not sure many of those in power know those details at this point either.
Oh, I think some do on the Labor side. They just don't want to tell you about it, Michael.
Maybe.
A bit of COVID news. The World Health Organization, they've abandoned the next steps of their inquiry into the origins of COVID-19. They're citing a lack of cooperation from China. Now, it would appear when you sort of wade through these papers, they have thrown in the towel here, Michael, that they're not chasing down a further visit to China. They're not chasing down further details of whether it came out of wet markets or perhaps out of a lab. We may never know the origin of COVID. I think that's important because we need to be able to do our best to prevent this sort of pandemic happening again. But we won't even have a national inquiry in Australia, given how many lives were lost and how many laws were imposed upon us without our say-so, and how much we wasted or spent protecting lives.
Well, surely it's imperative at the international level we get to the bottom of this, although I suspect it's a nigh on impossible task because the gathering of evidence in China obviously a very difficult thing to do. So I'm not sure that's going to come to fruition, although the attempt to try, I think, is valiant, and Scott Morrison was right to pursue it and all the rest of it. You're right, though, Peter. I think domestically, has there been an event in our lifetime which has altered our freedoms and our way of life, altered the way even the Parliament worked as much as COVID? Well, I'll do a Kevin Rudd, I'll answer my own question. No, there hasn't been. And yet, as you say, the lack of an attempt to forensically understand what we can do better next time, because there will be a next time in this increasingly globalised world, I think should concern a lot of people. Some state jurisdictions are doing their thing. WA, for example, I think good on them. But we do need a robust federal investigation, and it should cover a lot of different avenues.
And it should have the power to get documents off the states.
You bet.
I'll leave it there. Thank you, Michael Mclaren.